How are you?
I'm
Good
good.
morning.
How are you?
Good. Good.
Amita, we'll let you take a stab at answering some questions, too.
Well, look at that. 3, 2, 1. Good morning. Welcome to the third legislative coffee for the season. And we will be taking some questions after we've had opening statements from our two legislators. Kevin Jones is not with us this morning, so Karen and Blaine will have to do a little more heavy lifting. I have a few ground rules, though, that were prepared for me by the Chamber Committee so that I don't let something get out of hand. Be sure and use the microphone when you ask a question. And the person who is taking the microphone around, namely the mayor.
Prior mayor.
Excuse me.
Skidmore's the mayor now.
Oh, you still just act like it, though.
Ouch. Does anybody want the microphone?
I'm sorry. But anyway, she'll keep control of that and take it around. And so you may ask a question when the time comes, but be thinking right now how to get your question in the form of a question, because we're not going to have a long statement on anything. And turn your cell phones off. Last time I did this, I embarrassed myself, but I think I have it on vibrate this time, so maybe at least mine won't be ringing. I want to thank our sponsors this morning, the Ottawa Area Chamber of Commerce Legislative Action Committee, the Franklin County Farm Bureau Association, the American Legion Post number 60, and the AT&T. Refreshments are from the Farm Bureau. And I'm going to find out what happened to those donuts, so why we only have holes. Thanks to the City of Ottawa for providing us with this great room to have this. Easy parking and comfortable seats. And Matt Simonson for filming and making sure that we're going to be on the Government Access Channel. Of course, I'm a half a mile from the Government Access Channel where I live, so I'll never see it. But any more announcements I ought to be making? Okay, with nothing further to say, why, let's introduce our senator. And you can start out here, Karen.
Well, good morning. Good morning, everybody, and thank you to the sponsors. I know it's not easy. Some people kind of take this stuff for granted, but it does take a little bit of organization and effort, so we appreciate it. It's been an interesting couple of weeks, it's been a few weeks since we last saw you. It's good to see some new faces here and a lot of familiar old faces, too. It's been an interesting time in Topeka. We were told in the beginning of session by leadership not to bring anything forward unless it was life-threatening. Well, that sure changed quickly. Leadership decided they were going to run some legislation that wasn't considered life-threatening. We were waiting on a report from Senate leadership. They had hired an expert, and they were supposed to turn that report in March 15th. We got the report. I was told the report was delivered at 1:30 a.m. March 16th. And then when the report became public yesterday afternoon at 1 p.m., it wasn't what individuals had expected. It is interesting, and I'll talk a little bit about the politics. Before the report was made public, the Democrats had a press conference telling how horrible this idea was and how bad it was that we were going to listen to this person on the results of what we should do with our K through 12 education system. But I guarantee you at 1:10, their story had changed completely, how wonderful this report was and how much we need to increase K through 12 funding. So to me, the facts are still, the report was delivered. There were errors in the report. I spoke to one senator. He's got a school district out west. It said that there was 2,900 students in that school district. He said at most there's 140 students in that school district. So there are some discrepancies in the report. Hopefully we'll get a new updated report Monday to see what information we've got before us. But to me, the bottom line is we have to deal with school funding. We need to address the language in the Constitution, or else we will continue a cycle of lawsuits. We have 3 or 4 schools in the state of Kansas, there may actually be more, that take $5, they save $5 out of the money that they're budgeted for every student that they have and put it in an account for a future lawsuit. So right there, it tells you they're saving your tax dollars to sue for the future. The lawsuits need to be because of cause, not because they, it's just out of control what we're doing. So if we would address the Constitution and address school funding in a common sense manner, what is needed, not what is wanted, I think we can get some extremely positive results for the state of Kansas. And we also have to realize when we do that, one size does not fit all. What fits us here in Ottawa doesn't necessarily work in Norton or Dodge City or Clifton, Kansas. We have different size, different needs. And so we need to keep that in mind as we go forward also. The Senate, we've been working on a few issues, tax, other items, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Karen. And you may notice I made the assumption that since you've all been coming so faithfully, that I didn't even need to introduce the legislators. I wanted to ask you, Karen, was there some place in that report where they had one of the Johnson County enrollments mixed up with a Western Kansas enrollment?
Yeah. That's what it sounds like, but there were a couple of graphs in there that were inaccurate also. And I'll just state that for anybody to draw conclusions or make assumptions off of that report, it would be premature at this time.
Now that was for 1 year or for 5 years that they were
The
extrapolating?
funding?
Yes.
The $1.7 billion increase?
Yes.
I don't know. I just know that right now it's too soon to make judgment off of a report that the numbers are that misleading.
I have to note that's a good time, though, to put out a report when everybody's getting geared up, shall we say, for St. Patrick's Day.
Well, and we had a bit of another bad news yesterday. Yesterday was just an amazing day for information. The Senate Ways and Means Committee met, and there was discussion as to what to do with Osawatomie State Hospital. So I really want to put that on your radar in a big way. We have legislators from Wichita, legislators from Johnson County, that their priority is not Osawatomie. We need to form a coalition, a strong coalition, and be a strong advocate for the hospital and for mental health.
Thank you, Karen. Blaine, what do you have to say for this?
Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out today on a little bit of a dreary St. Pat's Day. I would guess there were quite a few tears in those green beers yesterday night, and will be again today after the study came out yesterday. The study called for 3 different tiers of funding. So if we want to keep doing what we've been doing, they said we have to put in another $500 million. If we want to get 90% of our kids to proficiency and graduation from high school, then we'd have to get another $1.7, $1.8 billion into the system. And if we want to get 95% of them there, we have to go all the way to $2.07 billion into K-12. Now, there are some mathematical and computational errors in the study, and I think it's too soon to say whether it's completely flawed or not. But anybody who places reliance in it, I would say that reliance is misplaced. I'd say overwhelmingly it appeared that the study was a disappointment in terms of the accuracy that came with it and the analysis that we got from it. It calls for those funding numbers over 5 years, so not all at once, and cautions the legislature against trying to put all that money in at once, as if we could. It calculates that currently we're spending about $4 billion on, a little over $4 billion on K-12. So if you were to go to the full extent of that study and put in another $2 billion, you'd essentially be taking all of the state general fund, every dollar in the state general fund, and putting it into K-12 schools, leaving nothing for anything else. The interim committee that I chaired, we looked at making some across-the-board cuts to try to come up with $600 million, and those were devastating enough, talking about closing prisons, closing state hospitals, laying off massive segments of the state workforce. If the court were to say that we had to put in $1.8 to $2 billion to K-12 education over the next 5 years, there would literally be nothing else that the state would do. So this is a very serious situation in which we find ourselves. I appreciate the fact that we have some of Ms. Campbell's students here this morning from the high school. You guys are going to be the next generation that will get to grapple with this at some point if we don't take action to find a better way to resolve disputes about school finance. And that's been a pretty consistent theme for me at these coffees this year, is we need to talk about what changes we need to make in our state constitution so that we don't find ourselves in this situation every 8 to 10 years. That doesn't mean I think we need to totally write the courts out of it. That doesn't mean that I think we need to do something punitive or something that's not thoughtful. But I do think it's time for us to re-examine the rules of the game and figure out if we can't come up with a better system. So hopefully we can start to have those conversations, as well as addressing the current need, the case that's ongoing, and trying to figure out what the right answer is to end that case and comply with the court's decision. There are a whole lot of other things happening this time of year in Topeka, and I look forward to your questions so we can kind of unpack those. I'm sure you may have more questions about education and school funding, and we can sure talk about those too. But I want to thank all of you for being here today and for the opportunity to come visit with you.
Well, Blaine, why don't you hit one or two more of those issues, and maybe that'll trigger some questions.
Sure.
As well as you, because we've got a little time here. What else?
Well, a couple of things I've been working on this week. We've got juvenile crisis intervention. We talk about mental health, and it is such a big issue in our communities. And in the wake of the juvenile justice bill that passed a couple years ago, we've been working with our prosecutors and judges who say we're still getting kids into the system that used to be we'd put them in jail. But what we understand now is that they really have mental health issues, that they have substance abuse issues, they need help in some other way, they don't need to go to jail. And so we're working on a juvenile crisis intervention center, which would allow for, much like we did for adults last year in mental health crisis, would allow for juveniles who are undergoing that sort of crisis to get very short-term, targeted help in those areas and then get them back home as quickly as possible so that we can keep kids from being a harm to themselves, a harm to others, or making decisions that quite frankly put them in a position that will be hard to recover from as they grow into adulthood. So that's one of the things I'm proudest of. I've been working with a multidisciplinary team up there, social workers and prosecutors and state departments, and we've got a bill that was introduced on Thursday, so it will be coming back to the House Judiciary Committee for a hearing this coming week. It looks like we'll be able to try to access some of the money we've saved by not locking kids up to actually use this to develop the community-based services. So I'm pretty excited about that. It's not something that makes a lot of headlines, but it's something that ultimately we need, and I think will be a good thing long-term for the state.
Karen, would you like to hit another subject, and then we'll go to questions?
Sure. There's been plenty of subjects before the Senate these last few weeks, and I hear the representatives chuckle. He's accurate. We spent quite a few hours on the floor one day debating guns this week. It was an interesting debate. I encourage you, the nice thing about the local papers is we get to work with them, and they're very conscientious about having their information accurate, and I appreciate that so much. There was an editorial in the Kansas City Star that was quite interesting a couple of weeks ago. It talked about the taxing exemption that I talked about the last coffee, that you can exempt in deductions on your income tax. And what was interesting was they said how Tyson pushed the bill through. Tyson, it was her bill, and that's fine. I'll take ownership of that bill any day. And then it said how another senator said it was premature, it was reckless, it was just a horrible thing to do. But what the editorial neglected to say was she voted for the bill. Yes, she did say those things, but then the final vote on the bill was a count of 31. So only 9 individuals did not vote for the bill. So it's kind of interesting. And then with the gun bill, we had a similar situation. We had some amendments. One of them that was actually a good amendment if the language would have been right for it. And it was dealing with bump stocks. It would have outlawed the use of bump stocks in Kansas, but the language was not correct in the amendment. So I did not vote for it, and others did not vote for it. We asked the carrier of the amendment to change the language, or one of us could have written the amendment and taken it too, but it was such short notice that we couldn't get it correct, the language correct. So what we did do was talk to the chairman of the Fed and State Committee, and he's willing to introduce a bill so that we can have the debate and we can start talking about bump stocks, especially if something doesn't occur at the federal level. So we are working on it, but that's not what came out, and you wouldn't have known that that's how the debate went. I guess the devil's in the details. So,
Is there a question out there at this point? State your name and don't hold on to the mic.
Oh, to give you the mic. But I'm not the mayor. So you are.
Well, the question, I'm Linda Alderman, the question I have segues really into what you just said. I was just curious as a citizen and a voting citizen, have you ever, do you now, or do you anticipate receiving campaign funds from the NRA? And what is your NRA rating?
I don't think I've received money from the NRA ever. Yeah, my husband's shaking his head no, too. I don't ever remember receiving money from them. I do have an A rating with the NRA. In fact, when I first ran for the House in 2010, the NRA endorsed my opponent. It was a Democrat opponent, but she did have the NRA endorsement. So I'm proud to have their endorsement, though, for my Senate races, and I hope that we can work with the NRA. I know that they are trying to work on language on the bump stocks and other items. We keep talking about the guns, but to me, the issue is not guns. I know that's the tool being used, but it's more an issue of our society and where we're at in our society. It's a mental health issue. It's the individuals that are using the guns. And, I've talked to several people, and most of you guys are in the age that you would remember this. When we went to school, there were guns in the back of the window of the vehicle. And not only that, the vehicles were unlocked. And it was never a question or an issue. So we really have to ask ourselves, what's changed? What is causing or bringing on this situation?
I have never received any campaign contributions from the NRA. I don't think they give at the state level. The issue that has been raised recently about their donations at the federal level, I think that's where they tend to give money. So I've not received any campaign contributions from the NRA. At this time, my rating with them is an A. I have taken positions from time to time that they don't agree with. Last year's vote about guns in mental health institutions and state hospitals was one of them that I disagreed with them on, and I voted to not have guns in those facilities. And we talked about that last year at Legislative Coffee. I do want to segue just briefly to the conversation about school safety. We did have a school safety bill that the Speaker asked me to help develop with him and a group of other legislators, and they unveiled that last week. I think it got a hearing this week in the House Appropriations Committee and will be coming out. And that is an attempt to address some of the, as I said at the last coffee, this is a multifaceted problem. It's not just one thing, and there won't just be one solution. But this does put some money behind trying to provide hardening and security for schools so that they can develop a safety plan in conjunction with local law enforcement and county emergency management. That they can have access to some funds to develop security protocols. We here in Ottawa are fortunate. We have fairly modern schools and are upgrading them even now, but there are districts within this county and other places that are still, security would be an incredible challenge if you look at some of our neighbors around in the rural areas of the county to try to secure those buildings. And that's an area where we do need to make an investment and try to help get those schools to be more secure. And I think what I talked about earlier with juvenile crisis intervention, a way to identify kids like the one in Florida who had thrown up many red flags before he took the actions that he took. If we have a crisis intervention capability here in this state, we will be able to take young people like that and get them the treatment that they need before those violent actions take place. So it will take multiple different ways to try to solve the problem, but I am happy to have been part of working on the school security bill and part of working on juvenile crisis intervention for mental health services.
Do we have another question out there? I'll send my runner around if you do.
Please stand up. Tell us who you are.
Chuck Tillman. I'd like to go back to the school finance issue. Although the report that you received was most likely flawed in some ways, I think it's pretty evident that no matter what happens, there's going to have to be a significant amount of money if the state of Kansas is going to make steps forward in providing an education for our students. So, where are you two in terms of where you see funding coming down? What will you support? What do you think is going to be the ultimate? And what can you do in order to assist the state providing the funds that have been needed for many years now?
You've asked a question that assumes kind of a premise, and so I want to try to work around both of those things. You know, I think that the ultimate number is somewhere between, $400 and $600 million. The court tells us $600 million unless we have a study that shows a different number. I do think the current study that was just turned in is flawed, and so I'm not sure that I go with $1.8 billion. The state will have to come up with some amount of funding, and that's where I think that range is, between 4 and 6. I think that all of the options need to be on the table. We need to talk with the plaintiff districts. We need to talk internally about what kind of funding is reasonable. I had asked the question of Randy Watson, Dr. Watson, about how much can the system really absorb every year. In other words, just dumping money into schools doesn't always lead to wise spending decisions, and even administrators will tell you we'd rather have stability. We'd rather know what we're going to get on kind of a multi-year basis. So I think whatever that number ends up being, it's probably going to be over multiple years and not just in 1 year. I think we have to remember that both last year and this year, there were hundreds of millions of dollars added to K-12 spending in the state. So there's already been an investment in trying to get more money into schools, and I think that will continue to the tune of somewhere between 400 and 600 by the end of this session. Our teachers, you included, Chuck, and I know that Linda used to teach and is now a school board member, and we have others in the room, do an exceptional job for the most part of educating our kids. Our scores, stacked up against nationwide scores, are excellent. Our schools are traditionally top 10 in the nation. Our graduation rate is 4 or 5 points above the national average. We do an exceptional job of educating children in this state. But the conversation that we have to have is how much is enough, and at what point is it more than the system can bear. If we fund this study at the level that it suggests, you would be looking at probably a $40 million property tax increase to fund that through property tax. The state can't sustain that kind of taxation. And there are other needs beyond K-12. So we have to somehow balance how we make that a priority. And right now it's a 54% of our state budget. It is a priority. It can't be 100%. It likely isn't sustainable at 60 or 65%. So what number can we agree on is sustainable and we can still deliver great education? Because I think that what's happening in most of our buildings around this state is a great education. And I'm not sure that another $1.8 billion is going to secure us phenomenally better results than being top 10 schools in the nation. So that's the assumption buried in the question that I guess I would challenge a little bit, is that we're radically underfunded, number one, and that more money is always going to equal more achievement. I think there is a broader conversation that needs to take place that's not just special interest groups butting heads over dollars, and a real conversation about what do we need, how do we do it, and how do we balance the priorities, because there are multiple priorities within our state budget.
Anything to add to that, Karen? I see you nodding your head.
I am nodding my head. It is a matter of defining priorities, not only priorities as a state within our state budget, but priorities for our education system. We have tried repeatedly to make it mandatory 65% of the funding go to the classroom and the teachers. And we cannot get that passed. The only thing we can get passed is that 65% of the funding is a goal to go to the classroom and the teachers. So we do need to have the tough conversations, and we do need to define our priorities as a state and our priorities for our schools and our classrooms. I'm very proud of my Kansas education, as most of us are. We have individuals, and I know you've heard me say this, that are trying to decide, do they pay their tax, do they buy food, or do they buy their medicine? Their property tax, we've heard testimony this year, one veteran came in, he can no longer afford to keep his home because of his property tax. That 40 mil increase that was mentioned, there was a bill in the House that would have gradually taken us up, I think, to 36 mil or 38
16 mils.
Increase over a matter of years. They couldn't get a vote to get it out of the House committee. So there is not an appetite for increasing property tax to pay for this. I just hope that we can start having the tough discussions. We need to sit down, you know how you do with your family, you sit down at the table and you have the family discussion. Well, that's what we need to do as a state. What are our priorities and where do we want to go?
Karen, I always like to show that I'm old and remember the three-legged stool. With this kind of a suggested amount of money, where does that stand with the old three-legged stool of sales tax, property tax, and
Well, I'm glad you asked about the stool. That's kind of it's actually a misnomer.
I said I was old. I'm going way back.
Well, you're not that old. What's interesting with property tax, and I made it specifically clear to the committee and conferees, property tax, we do collect it and 20 mil goes to the state, but the rest of the property tax stays local for your county, schools, and other taxing entities, cemeteries, whatever it may be, fire. The 20 mil that goes to the state, 1.5 mil is capped at the state level, but the rest of it is returned to the school. So the three-legged stool for the state is not, the state taxes collected, their leg of the property tax is about a very small portion of it.
Well, I was
So-
thinking more of the division between sales tax and property tax and what's the third
Income.
one? Income tax, yes,
Yeah,
as
yeah.
a whole source.
Yeah, property tax is not part of the state's equation for sourcing government. It is local, and it is the schools that are taxed with property tax. We've had a massive income tax last year, a retroactive income tax, and then 2 years ago, we had a very large, it was the largest tax increase at the time, sales tax increase. We are maxed out on our taxes. There is not an appetite at the state to increase taxes again.
Sure, I'm going to let, because Mr. Tillman's a great teacher, I'm going to let him do a follow-up. Sorry, Almeda.
That's all right. I don't see a lot of hands waving out there. There's one.
You talked about the taxes and what's been happening in the past, and yet the increases that were enacted over the last couple of years are not yet equal to the cuts that were made in prior years. So our reenactment of some of those taxes back to the level they were previously going to be a part of the conversation rather than a reliance and only a discussion about property taxes.
I'll go ahead with that.
Yeah.
There is, I don't think you'll see a tax increase this year. Members of both parties, leadership in both parties have said there's no appetite for a tax increase this year. And with a multi-year phase-in of whatever money is put towards K-12, in addition to what's been done the last 2 years, there is a chance that some payment can be feathered in for this coming year without having to raise taxes, but it will obviously not reach the levels of what the court's requiring. So there will have to be a tax increase at some point. My guess is that it will be after an election. There will be conversations about it next year. And the unfortunate folks who come and sit down in those chairs in January of 19 will be walking into a bad situation the same way we have walked into a bad situation every one of the last 6 years in terms of state finances. I will tell you that leadership in the House has been saying we don't want to focus on how we go home this year. We want to focus on how we fix the problem long term. The problem is that when both parties are also saying they don't want to raise taxes this year, there's no, a long-term fix is either going to require deep spending cuts to those areas that are not K-12, the same ones we're all talking about: mental health, state hospitals, public safety, prisons, child welfare system, or you're going to have to look at revenue enhancements at some point, which nobody wants to do, myself included. I don't want to see a tax increase this year. I don't want to see a tax increase next year if we could find a way to avoid it. You ask about tax rates. Income tax rates are lower today than they were in 2011 before the tax cuts of 2012. They would, if you raise them up again to whatever those pre-2012 levels were, it's still not enough to fund the K-12 decision. So, and sales tax was supposed to come back down in 2015, and did not. It's still at 6.45 statewide, which is pretty high. And there's not a lot of tolerance to jump that up anymore. So that's why property tax gets referenced a lot, because the state, the 20 mil levy does go directly to K-12. So
Yeah, it's actually, sorry, Representative, it's 6.5 statewide, the sales tax, instead of 6.45. But he's absolutely correct that on what he said. The other interesting thing about that is the cuts to K through 12 were prior to both of us being elected. It was 2009, 2010, and they were drastic cuts. And we still are trying to catch up as to when those cuts did occur. But we have been increasing funding for K through 12 since
You
then.
anticipated my question there, because there was a time when it was much more than 20
35.
during the, Graves administration?
In the late 90s, when the state had surpluses, they ratcheted that down. I was an intern then. It was always fun to go to the Capitol then, because it was, how much are we going to cut taxes this year? And I thought when I ran, maybe we'd get to do that again, but boy, was I wrong.
Sarah, have you got somebody back there?
I do.
Hey, I'm Richard Oglesby. You're so nice. Regardless of what Alan said. No, my question is, since we're talking tax here, is there is a tax out there that, and of course nobody likes to talk about tax increases, but there is a tax out there, sales tax, that I think we're missing. And that's the society change that we are experiencing with internet sales, and we're missing those sales tax that come from that, from people that are outside of our state. I believe that money could come back locally to local cities, local counties, to help us fill the gap. And I'm just wondering where you all stand on that to try to fix the problem. It's on an honor system now, and the honor system may not be working.
Well, there has been a lot of discussion. We've had hearings in the House and the Senate on that issue. What happens in the state of Kansas is when you buy online and you are not charged a sales tax on the product, you're on your honor. You are, under state statute, obligated to pay sales tax to the state. And we do have some individuals that do that. And we do have some companies and organizations now that are collecting sales tax online. But the bottom line is there are those that aren't. And to our brick and mortars, our local mom and pops, it's a hardship. They're competing against businesses that they've never competed against before because of the online information. We've looked at several thoughts on how to handle this. One was as drastic as Colorado, which was very extreme. I don't think we'll end up that way, but Massachusetts took the opinion of, if you have a cookie on your machine from the business, then that is a presence in Kansas. And so therefore, sales tax should be collected on that purchase. So there's different avenues being looked at right now, and it's also being looked at the federal level. I know the president's mentioned some stuff. There's some pushback as a nationwide sales tax, but there is some look as to, and there's a lawsuit. I know the representative could speak more to the quill and other items. We did join the, we're with South Dakota and a few other states in trying to address this issue.
Yeah, I would echo those comments. There is a suit from the South Dakota law, and then there's the Colorado method, depending on, there's kind of two schools of thought about how we're going to ultimately end up taxing internet sales, and the feds haven't really set the parameters, so the states are trying to do it. The South Dakota statute is a little more aggressive. It also provided for a direct appeal to the Supreme Court, so they could expedite that case. My hope is that it is upheld, and that we will be able to create then kind of a uniform system with 50 states able to legally tax that commerce. You understand the Commerce Clause of the Constitution says that only Congress can regulate interstate commerce, and no state can place a burden on interstate commerce. So for us to collect a sales tax, that's the difficult part, is getting the jurisdictional element right so that we can collect that tax and not run afoul of the Commerce Clause of the Constitution. So it would be easiest if the feds would do it. Then it would just be uniform and we'd be done. But since they haven't, we're left trying to get this done. And I support making sure that those sales that take place here in Kansas, we get the tax off of those. Fortunately, Amazon has physical plant here in the state, so they do collect sales tax. And being the world's largest online retailer, it's good that we have them here in Kansas, both for the jobs and for the fact that they have to collect sales tax on Amazon purchases here. So we're not missing out in the same way that some states are.
Did you ever get the feeling they're trying to be the only?
It sure looks like they're heading that way.
And this is so equitable, because wherever Sarah is, I know that's where the questions.
I'll go to that side next, I promise.
Okay. Yes, sir.
2 from there, 2 from here.
Okay, my name is John Holland, and I want to note that Senators Roberts, Moran, and Congresswoman Jenkins have all expressed great concerns with Trump's impending trade war as a result of his tariffs. How does that figure into the State House planning for taxes in the next couple of years?
The Consensus Revenue Estimating Group will meet and come out with their revenue estimates in April. It's not something that the legislature participates in, but the Craig Group, CREG, typically takes into account all of those national and international economic factors as it tries to develop its plan. And I would assume they will be looking at that as well, and as well as the changes to the federal tax plan, which have, ironically enough, created a bit of a windfall for Kansas, and the likely move by the Fed to raise interest rates 3 times this year, which will also have an effect on revenues.
Yeah, the federal income tax cuts in 17 did impact the state coffers, and we have seen an increase. We'll have more of an idea of that in April, after the April numbers, as to how big of an impact it was. We are also seeing an impact because of the Kansas state income tax increases. So it's we need to decipher where the money's coming from, which impact it is. The tariffs are something to be aware of. It impacts our Kansas economy. We absolutely have to be aware of this and keep it on our radar, as it is critical to the Kansas economy. We are a rural state. We are an agriculture state, and what they do at the national level impacts us.
You know, I have to say, as an aside, the next morning when I heard the news that the president was putting a tariff on certain things, and I thought retaliatory, good Lord, the soybeans. First thing that came to mind, bins of soybeans, because we export so much of soybeans for our income.
Almeda, I actually have a question. I want to go back to what we discussed last month about parimutuel racing.
I see George out here.
Yeah.
I do see George. Hi, George. And want to go back to that discussion that you had about that. And so it appears as though HB House Bill 2545 is now on general orders at the House. And it looks like that was amended, and that I don't know what the appetite is for having casinos be expanded to allow parimutuel racing too. Are we looking at having, if that happens, are we looking at allowing track staff casinos without racing? Because that's what it appears to have happened with the amendment. And
let's just defer to George.
No, we're going to ask our representatives. It's okay. That's who I'm asking my question to. Sorry.
I was afraid you were asking it to me.
No. And what is your overall position on parimutuel racing, considering the monetary challenges that the state of Kansas has?
Could you repeat the question?
Absolutely.
There were a lot of
Sorry,
amendments.
Almeda can do.
And it had my
Sure.
attention.
It looks like that HB 2545, which may come to you, certainly, may be allowing tracks to have casinos without racing. And then I just wanted to know what your overall position was on expansion of parimutuel racing, considering the challenges that we have monetarily with the state of Kansas.
I have not seen the bill, and has it passed out of the House? It has not.
No, it's below the line.
Yeah, so in the Senate, the chairman of Fed and State has, I think, refused to have a hearing on that. Is that correct, George?
It's had a hearing.
No, not in the Senate.
The House has
Not
heard
you,
it.
but
The
it's
Senate
had
has not.
hearings.
Yeah, the Senate is, the chairman is refusing to have a hearing, but I think there's another chairman that is amenable to having a hearing, is what I've heard through the grapevine. So we will keep our eyes on that.
So what's your position on the expansion of parimutuel racing in Kansas?
In parimutuel racing?
Yeah, I mean, including casinos.
Yeah, I did not campaign on increasing gambling in the state of Kansas.
good.
So I feel like my position has to be, well, you guys have heard me say this. You can take my palm card, you know how I campaigned, and that's where I'm at. But I understand that we've got a group of individuals that are local constituents, that the horses are a big issue for them. And so we need to figure out what we can do to find a conclusion that both sides work together and we have positive results for the state of Kansas.
This issue comes up almost yearly. It's kind of an annual issue for us up in the legislature. I've not seen the amended bill as it came out of committee. I've been approached by folks on both sides of the issue to meet with them. I've been a little busy with House Judiciary business, but we'll be talking with both sides again probably this coming week. Whether or not the bill gets above the line, absent some procedural maneuver, will be up to the majority leader and the speaker, and they will make that decision. I don't know that the bill will get above the line. My understanding of the amendment in committee had more to do with the repayment of the privilege fee that may be at issue if the current casino operators who have contracts with the state say that the state has breached their agreement by allowing competition from, remember we call them racinos, the racetracks with slot machines. And so there was a provision in the bill about how that got repaid and using a letter of credit, and my understanding is that there may have been a committee amendment that changed that in some way, and I have not had a chance to review it yet. That's a lengthy bill, and it's a very complex bill, and there are a lot of issues of contract law, constitutional law, and potential financial risk for the state that all have to be addressed before I will have a comfort level saying that, yes, I'm absolutely behind it. I would love to see both of these groups get together. They are, on both sides, men of means. They have a great deal of wealth. They know how to make money. They should sit down together and figure out how both of them can prosper on this deal and come back to the state with a compromise position that has no financial risk. And I thought we were headed down that road last year, and it didn't end up happening. But that would be my preferred resolution of this matter, is that the sides sit down and broker a deal together whereby they both can make money and not put the state in the middle of it.
Before we leave this subject, are there any more questions on the racing issue? Okay. Don't you have any more questions? Here's a question up here.
I'm waiting for either one.
I see two here.
Paul, you're next. I had to go to this side. Almeda said.
That's fine. I'm here till 11 o'clock.
All right. Harry Peckham. Mr. Finch mentioned in his comments about school safety, about we need to set up interventions programs and we need to be able to treat some people that we pull out. I'm wondering, where are we going to treat them if we're closing hospitals like Osawatomie?
So that's the issue, is how do we create crisis intervention facilities? And that's why I said we'd be looking at using the money we save by closing down some of the juvenile prisons and use that money instead to create crisis intervention centers where we can do that. As the Senator talked about, the possibility of privatizing Osawatomie State Hospital is still out there and being discussed. They have lobbyists who are making the rounds in the building and trying to talk legislators into why this is a good idea in their opinion. I'm not sold that it's a good idea, quite frankly. We need to be investing in mental health facilities and mental health beds for people who are in crisis and people who need inpatient treatment. And we need to be investing in our community mental health centers so that people who need outpatient services can get them. And it is a combination of the two. I'm very frustrated, quite frankly, with KDADs at the state that they have not moved swiftly to get all of the beds reopened at Osawatomie. In my opinion, it's a dereliction of their duty, and they are negligent in doing what they should do to get all of those beds back open. I believe it's precipitating an intentional crisis so that they can privatize the facility and try to make a case for getting someone else in there to build a 100-bed facility and operate it privately, because that has been the dream of the prior administration and may still be, for all I know. I disagree vehemently with that approach. We should do the best job that we can do, and if there's a case to be made for privatization, it should be made on its own merits.
Well, you know, I fought privatization from the beginning, even with the food facility. That proved to be, we were correct. They had the food services at the Osawatomie State Hospital that they put out for bid, privatized it, and we ended up getting a lesser service as a result of it. I was the person that carried the amendment, not only in the Ways and Means Committee on one bill, but on the floor on another bill that said we had to have legislative approval in order to privatize Osawatomie or Larned or Parsons state hospitals, any of them, and Topeka too, the 4 state hospitals. So the difficult reality, and you've heard me talk about it, is we've got 20 senators of 40 that are from the 5 largest counties in the state. And we've got 125 state reps. 25 of those state reps touch just one county alone, Johnson County. 8 of the 40 senators are one county alone, Johnson County. Well, what we've got going on is our Senate President, Johnson County, or Sedgwick County, Wichita, Majority Leader, Johnson County, the Speaker, Johnson County of the House, Speaker Pro Tem, Johnson County. I mean, you can tell my pattern here. We are outnumbered in leadership, and we're outnumbered in the caucus. And they have been having meetings discussing whether to have regional facilities, whether to increase beds at Osawatomie, what the options are with the state. Well, yesterday I was told that the Senate or Chair of Ways and Means announced that we need the regional facilities and we may not need to build anything or to do anything in Osawatomie. And I don't know if this is a reality check, if she was just speaking off the cuff or if somebody misheard her. But the reality is there is an effort. And I think we need to increase the number of beds in Osawatomie. We could build a new facility. We have reached out to Osawatomie. We've reached out to the county, Miami County. They are both willing to have skin in the game. In fact, they're willing to put up the building, the financing of the building in the state to pay the local unit. That would be a unique situation. Instead of a private entity doing it, though, it would be a government-to-government relationship. I'm trying to think outside the box, as are other legislators, in order to solve this problem. But we do have to realize that we are not in the majority at this point. So our argument has to be strong and cohesive, and we have to protect Osawatomie and our mental health system in Kansas. We need more beds, not less. Granted, we do need some beds in Wichita and other locations, but we also need to keep Osawatomie State Hospital, Larned State Hospital, and our other facilities running. It is so critical to the state. And our community health centers, they're a big part of this equation also. So working together, I think we can get the best results for Kansas. I absolutely believe that.
not standing up. Thank you.
I'm going to give you the mic though, Paul.
First of all, let me state that I don't have an agenda, okay? This question is related to school funding, and I would like for you to perhaps refresh my memory. It seems to me that when the state started allowing the lottery system, Powerball, and that sort of thing, that there was supposed to be funding from that directed to education to relieve the tax burden of the taxpayer. Do you refresh my memory there? Am I correct, or are we getting anything from those folks?
It depends on who you ask as to whether that was supposed to go to. When I asked state officials about it, some state officials, they told me that that campaign never occurred in Kansas, that it was a Missouri campaign to put lottery money into school funding. There is a small portion of the lottery that goes to the state general fund, which goes to school funding. But there's nothing from the lottery that goes directly to K through 12 funding.
Really?
Not directly K through 12. It goes to the state general fund and then gets to K through 12 that way.
How did we miss that opportunity?
I wasn't in the legislature at that time. In fact, I think I might have still been in college. Or
Yeah, that's true. That's often kind of conflated the two, but Missouri's campaign was that they were going to put all their lottery proceeds, all their profits, lottery profits, back into education, and they do. And in Kansas roundabout, we get some of it there, but it is through the general fund, and 54% of that goes to K-12.
Well, I'll help to fill the airwaves a little bit here. Again, I'm John Holland, and I have a question. Is anybody in the Kansas House or Senate properly embarrassed yet by the Secretary of State and would-be Governor Kobach's pathetic appearance advocating for his voter suppression tactics in front of a federal judge, and the fact that his own expert witnesses have been basically destroying his own case? And so are you planning to try and clip his wings and get him back to working for the state of Kansas, bringing in business, versus trying to continue the voter suppression?
Whoa, I think I heard a statement in there. I did hear the question at the end, though.
Good point.
Anybody want to take on Secretary?
Yeah, believe
It's
me,
almost
I've been
11 o'clock.
focused on what's going on in the legislature at this. That's enough on. I have no idea what's going on with the Secretary of State at that.
I haven't followed the case this week, but I know there are discussions about prosecutorial authority over voter fraud issues and that sort of thing, and I think the question's probably best directed at the crop of candidates running for that office, because we will have a different Secretary of State in January of 2019, some 9 months from now, and I think most of them have already said they don't really care that the office has that authority. And so I would imagine that will be an issue that will be revisited in the beginning of the 2019 session.
Yeah, I do remember when we voted on that legislation. I did not vote to provide that authority with the
I didn't
Secretary
either.
of State's office. We do need to protect the integrity of the ballot. That's critical. That's one thing in the United States that we do trust, that our votes are being counted and counted properly and accurately. So it's an important issue. We don't take it lightly. I've been completely focused on the state legislature the last couple of weeks.
We have other questions?
I have one more, if nobody does. Harry Peckham again. I operate an agritourism operation out east of town, and it's come to my attention that there was a lawsuit in Johnson County that was ruled recently that agritourism operations like mine are exempt from county zoning and building codes and possibly other regulations, and I'm wondering if that's what the legislature intended when they passed that agritourism liability law. I think that's where it's drawn from. Any response?
I haven't seen the case. I'd like to read it. I mean, it sounds fascinating, because my understanding of the law, it was simply about liability, premises liability, and not about zoning and land use regulations. Of course, there are zoning and land use regulations even for ag parcels, but they're not they cannot be as strict as there are for residential and that sort of thing. You can put a barn where you want to put a barn kind of thing. But I'd be fascinated to look at the case. If you have a copy or a citation of it, I'd be happy to read it.
No, that's what my county planning director is telling us. He now has his hands tied. He can do nothing with operations like ours.
Huh. I do know we do, on a similar issue, we do have a bill to fix the Amusement Park Act that was passed last year in the wake of the Schlitterbahn tragedy. And the attempt to fix that because we had issues with even hayrack rides being interpreted to be an amusement that needed to be inspected. And
I
so
almost wonder if maybe this really could not be applied to that.
I don't know. We do have I don't know. It could be. We do have a bill coming to fix that one. So I know that that's on its way this year.
You know, I cannot remember fewer questions towards the end. How about you, Sarah?
Me neither. Are you sure?
I think
Going
we
once.
get Representative Jones back.
Can
He must bring.
we get him on the phone? Maybe he has a question for you guys. Just a thought. Maybe Josh Walker, you have a question, or Amy Finch, or lots of quiet people here. And all the high school students? No, whose some are already gone. I bet Mrs. Campbell would give extra credit, right?
Here's a hand over here.
They were talking earlier about parimutuel betting. Oh, I'm Sandra Stephen. I'm from Pomona. I'm curious, is anybody talking about bringing greyhound racing back? Because it's a cruel sport.
That's part of what would happen at the racetracks is it would be both horse and dog racing. And then if you want to add the other element into it, there is a case going on right now in New Jersey about sports betting. And if that case were to be decided in a certain way, then all of the states could have sports betting as well. So that's another component that is at issue in the discussions. But yes, the tracks would run horse and dog racing. All right.
Okay. Oh, John Cohen.
John Cohen, Chamber of Commerce. So I know how through the course of the legislative session, the Ways and Means and House of Probes works at building a budget, and usually we kind of hear some about that process during the course of a session, but of course education has just suppressed all that. So I assume there's been work going to get a budget bill out, and how has that been quantified in terms of education, and where is the work in that process? Because obviously there's a lot of heavy lifting to be done in that process, and coming up with budgets for all the state agencies, and not just where we're going to spend on education is intense work. So where is all that process? It's kind of been overshadowed just by education this time.
Well, actually,
Go ahead. Tell us
Okay.
in a side, and I'll give you the House side.
yeah, I'll give you, yeah. What happened a couple of years ago, we went to a 2-year budget cycle. So in theory, there shouldn't be much work going on the budget this year because we're on an off budget cycle. It should be the second year of the budget. But with the lawsuit going on and other items, Osawatomie and a few other things, they are having budget hearings and committee hearings to address that. It's amazing because as soon as it was announced that taxes collected were up, increased state revenues, almost every agency and department came in with their hand out. So and tax, as far as the House has taken a little different approach, but the Senate, we've had hearings on, you've heard me talk about it, we don't have a fair and level tax system in the state of Kansas. It picks winners and losers. And I asked for an interim committee this summer, and they gave us 2 days, and they didn't put me in charge of it, obviously for a reason, because I would have taken a deep dive into this. We've got food pantries that are listed by name in statute that have they get to enjoy the pleasure of no sales tax because they're listed. Other food pantries are not listed, so they pay sales tax. We've got a hospice. We've got 3 hospice centers in the state of Kansas that pay sales tax. The rest don't because of the way they've formed their business, or, to me, there should be some consistency in the statute. So we've had quite a few hearings as to individual groups coming before the committee to plead their case as to why they should be sales tax exempt also. I tried to work one of the bills. I thought it was a good cause. It was a small rural community. We could not even get, or actually on the Johnson County, it was a small group that wanted a sales tax exemption for disability. It was a very small exemption. I think it amounted to $10,000, less than $10,000. We couldn't even get a motion on the committee to move the bill out. Not one person would make the motion. So there is not an appetite to increase the fairness this year. I think that we need to rip the Band-Aid off, and since we have been doing so many studies at the state level, what I'm going to ask for is a commission study. We haven't had one since Bill Graves on tax. So I'm going to ask for a deep dive on tax, and that we break it up individually and start with property tax, then address sales tax, and then address income tax. And that way we can get the big picture for the state. And obviously this won't happen overnight, but it will help us in understanding our priorities too as a state by taking that dive. Because one of the biggest complaints we hear about is property tax. So we need to take a look at it without pulling the rug out from underneath the local governments.
Wayne, you got any last word for us?
Budget is proceeding in the House side. You know, they will do an off-year budget, even though most of it's been programmed. As far as the relationship to K-12, they lapsed the K-12 budget on the House side this week, meaning they just canceled it out. And the K-12 funding bill will come through the K-12 Budget Committee, as it did last year in the House. So unknown yet what that number will be. Previous question, we talked about that $400 to $600 million range is probably where I think it ends up.
Well, I am just stunned here that, Matt, have you turned us off?
We're still on.
It is just past 11, and it looks like everybody's satisfied with their questions and answers. Well, with their questions at least.
If I may, I know Representative and myself encourage you guys to get in touch with us. I know it's a busy time of year. You may make schedule meetings and stuff, and we might not be able to be available every single moment, but we do want to hear from you. You can email us, call us, or come up to the Capitol. We love seeing you there or seeing you here in the community, and we like hearing from you.
And I think George Wingert will give you a ride on any day that you want to talk about racetracks and slot machines, right? Okay. Thank you all for coming out today. Appreciate the time.